Welcome back to AutoTechNick, and today I'll be showing you guys the steps to not only reseal, but rebuild the front timing cover on your belt-driven V12 Ferrari. So before we really jump into this, I do think it's worth mentioning that everything that we're going to be covering today doesn't just apply to this 456 we're working on. It's really going to apply to all variants of the 456, the 456M, 550, 575, and 612. All of those cars use essentially the same architecture with their 65-degree V12. So it's really all of the belt-driven V12 Ferrari engines this will apply to. Now, another thing that's worth talking about is how far I have this car disassembled. So I actually have the radiator out of the car. You can also see that I have the timing belts off and the water pump out. Some of that you do need to do in order to get this repaired done to the car, but things like the water pump and the radiator, I actually have those out for different repairs right now. So you don't need to do those in order to do this repair on the 456. The radiator had leaks, so I took it out. It's at the radiator shop getting fixed. The water pump had a questionable bearing, so I have parts on the way and we're going to be rebuilding the water pump. Also, I have the car down basically midway through a timing belt service. I just want to bring that up because when you're resealing this front timing cover, you have to pull the timing belts off of the engine. Now, I will say that Ferrari stipulates that anytime the timing belts are put on an engine, tensioned and ran essentially, that if they come back off, they should be replaced. I mean, seems a little excessive. Now, fortunately for me and the customer, this car came in for a timing belt service. That's why it's in the shop. When I did my inspection, I saw that this timing case was leaking. So although the leak on this front timing case isn't that bad right now, this is more so a repair of opportunity, because if we were to not do this repair, put the car back together with the new timing belts, and then say in a year this leak gets much worse or we want to address it, we'd essentially have to go all the way back through and do this timing belt service again. It's one of those things that we caught the leak, we're moving into the timing belt service, and you can see that essentially we have a lot of stuff off and out of the way. It cuts down on the overlapping labor, and it doesn't cause the customer to have to go through another expense of an additional timing belt service on the car. If you're going to be doing this repair, try to time it with a timing belt service. Maybe you see your car starting to drip and leak a little bit, and say you're a year or two away from your timing belts, maybe you just keep an eye on it, see if that leak gets worse, and you see if you can stretch it out when you're doing the timing belts, because that is the time to get this done. So I will be covering all the work that I'm doing to this car, including the timing belt service, in a different series of videos. But for today, we're going to be focusing purely on resealing our front timing case. So if you guys want to see the other videos of the disassembly that got us up to this point, jump in the playlist and check out the other videos on this car. Alright, so let's get started up here on the top side, and we're going to have to focus our attention here. We need to get this power steering pump and bracket out of the way. You can see that it's overhanging quite a bit of our front timing case. So I'm going to set you guys down, grab some tools, and we're going to start working to get this stuff removed. So I think we'll start getting this power steering pulley off. Take our idler off here. Oof. So I see a Allen coming in on the back side. A couple 13s here. Looks like another Allen holding the pump on. It's got 19 there. Probably gonna have to separate this pump from the bracket. We'll see. Actually, I think if I just get this front part of the bracket off, I can leave the pump in place. So let's work just to get the front section off. And this wrench really works great. It's actually a bit driver ratchet, so you can see that my overall length's pretty low, and that lets me get back here, and hopefully with it being a long handle, gives me enough torque to get that bolt loosened up. So this is far better than trying to use an Allen wrench in there. I actually use this ratchet a lot. It's one of my favorites. I'll show you guys that guy. So I think if I remember correctly, Snap-on doesn't sell this in the long flex head ratchet. I actually bought two ratchets and made it as one with this little bit driver ratchet. Try to get it in focus here. Another Allen coming from the back side. Another one buried down here. At this point, it's going to be easier to take the pump all the way off. Okay, so I decided to fully remove the power steering pump. You can see I have it zip tied up and out of the way. So I was initially going after it to only remove this front bracket that was sitting on the front side of the pump, because really this was the only thing that's sitting in front of the timing case. However, once I was getting into it, I decided just to take the whole bracket off, this rear bracket, because by the time I got all of this hardware out, it was only like 2 more bolts to remove this. And it's going to give me more working space, but it's also going to make cleanup of these parts a lot easier. Rather than trying to clean this up with it in the car, I can clean it up outside of the car. And I also have a lot more space. They clean up back here on the back side where all that oil had leaked. Kind of covered it briefly. You can see all the hardware. There was a lot of hardware that bolts in on the back side of this bracket. So this is the rear side of the bracket that's facing the engine or the back of the car. Lots of hardware back there that I had to get out in order to get that off. And I tried showing you guys, but it wouldn't focus, and my little wrench that I had made. So I had it made with a flex head. You may be able to get them like that now, but it's just a little bit driver with a small bit. It's a 6mm in there, and you can see that a 6mm 3/8 drive socket, which would be the normal size for 6mm with that ratchet, just the length of it is really the issue, and the head size, you're not going to fit that in there. And with a long handle, you have typically enough leverage to get everything broken loose and tightened back up. So this comes in very handy. One of my favorite tools in the toolbox. Also, I got our idler tensioners off, and you can see that they have just replaceable bearings in there with a snap ring, and that is part of the timing belt service that I go through and replace these bearings. So we'll set those aside and get those bearings replaced. Coming back to the engine, it looks like we really have a lot of access. It looks like we're most of the way there. You can see that we have our bolts around the perimeter for this timing case. We have this cover here, and I can tell you that that is covering the drive gear for the oil pump, and there's also a chain that runs up to the crankshaft. Now, this is the part that can get tricky because it's not as simple as removing the perimeter bolts to getting this timing cover off. These shafts right here have a helical gear in them, which splines into a helical gear that's on the crankshaft, and that's what's driving these 2 idler shafts here. There's 4 bearings in play for these shafts. There's 2 in the front timing case here that are retained in with a snap ring, and there's 2 in the back and the inside and the block. So there's a couple things at play that make getting this front timing cover off a lot harder than it needs to be. One of the main things is our oil pump drive chain, which is behind this cover. We'll have this cover removed here in a second, but that chain runs up around another gear on our crankshaft snout up here. Now also we have our timing shafts right here, and obviously we have the gears up here. They're on a shaft that runs through this cover and into the back of the engine. Now there's bearings supporting the back end of the shaft that are in the block, and there's also bearings in the front of this case holding the shaft. So there's 2 bearings per shaft. The bearings that are in the case right here, or the front cover, are locked in with a snap ring, and they're going to want to stay with the shafts. It's a very tight fit, meaning when we pull everything forward, it's going to want to pull these shafts out of the bearings out of the back of the block off with the cover. Now the problem with that is the gears on these shafts are going to pull the gear that drives the chain for an oil pump. So if we don't do something about the chain, everything gets bound up on itself. So the solution to that is we'll take this cover off, we can remove the oil pump drive gear, and we can have the chain be loose, and then we can take everything off forward. However, it's still an incredibly tight fit with the bearings in the back of the block, and you don't have any good leverage points to really work this cover off or to press it or pull it off. In addition, we don't want to get any tooling back there and try to pry it, because that's all of our sealing surface and we don't want to mar it up and damage it and ding it. So it gets pretty difficult to get these off. We're not just resealing this cover, I'm going to be replacing all of the bearings. I'm going to go about it a little bit differently today, and I'm going to start with getting these timing gears off initially. You need a 28mm ring nut socket so you can get these off. And I will say that I do have my crankshaft locked and held in place as part of the timing belt service. So I'll be able to put some leverage on these. And I don't have to worry about these moving or rotating. And I can take these nuts off, slide these gears off. What I'm hopeful that I'm going to be able to do is hoping I can press this cover off and leave these gears, or leave these shafts in place and press them out of the bearings in the case. That's going to do a couple things for me. I think it's going to be a little easier to get the case off, but also you can see that I left these paint marks here, so I have that lined up on this rib, and the paint mark up there on the rib, and then this one's just indicating bank 2, and that paint mark bank 1. These helical gears, when I pull this cover off, they're going to want to rotate because that's just kind of how the teeth mesh into it. It's really difficult to get this all assembled and have these line up in the same location. So if I can leave these shafts in the engine and get the cover off without doing that, I don't have to worry about fighting the oil pump drive chain, but also it's going to let me make additional marks inside the engine to know where those shafts are meshed into my gear on the crankshaft. That way giving me a much better chance of getting this fully reassembled with these lower cam belt drive gears in the exact same location. So my goal here is to get this fully reassembled with everything in the exact same location, because that's going to save me a lot of work on my camshaft timing. Before I tore the engine down, I did run through a camshaft timing check and verified where it was set at, and everything on this engine is set within tolerance. So I'm hoping, really hoping, that I can get that front cover off, everything back assembled in the same location, get our belts on tension back to where it was, and that's really going to save a lot of time on the tail end with the degree in the camshafts. Fully aware that that probably doesn't make great content for the channel if I get everything apart and back together and I don't have to make any big changes on the camshaft timing. It doesn't really show the process very well, but that's kind of my own push and desire because I want to see if I can do it. It's like a challenge for me. I can tell you that so far in my career of getting these apart and back together, I have yet to do it that way. Every time I do it, I'm at least 1 or 2 teeth off. My camshaft timing is way out of spec, and I got to work all the way back through it. So that's probably what's going to happen. You'll still get to see the camshaft timing on the tail end, but I'm going to try to do. I think I'm going to work to get our cover off for our oil pump drive, and I'm also going to work to get our sprockets off right up here. I'll also get all the perimeter hardware off, and then I'll bring you guys back once we start working to get this cover off. Okay, so we're making really good progress, and now that we have everything off, we have a lot better visibility. You can see that I have the cover off for the oil pump drive gear and chain. I did end up taking the bolt for the gear off of the pump and slid it as far forward as I could. That was a bit more of a precautionary measure, or more so on the along the lines of how I was thinking I was going to take this cover off, but I've kind of changed my plan of attack, so I don't think that's necessary for what we're going to do, but we're going to leave it like that for now. I whipped the oil filters off real quick, just so that way they're out of the way. More importantly, I took the drive gears off for the timing belt on our shafts here. I ended up taking the Woodruff keys out. You can see that as well. And really the key thing here is I wanted to see where this Woodruff key lines up, so that way, essentially I want to get this right back in the same orientation when I reassemble everything. Fortunately, this key pretty much lines up with our existing mark there, pretty much right at top dead center. And over here on bank 1, it's essentially 90 degrees off on the side, so I just made an extra mark right there. And I'm hoping that that will be good enough to get those back into the position that they are now to help us out with our cam timing. With the gears off also, you can see the bearings here. They're pressed in this direction into the case and seated at the bottom. You can see the snap rings here that are retaining them in. So these bearings are coming out with this case or cover. I mentioned it earlier, one of the main problems is these bearings right here are pressed very tight onto this shaft, and this shaft has the gear on the back side. So if you pull this shaft right here out with the cover, you're pulling the gears, which they rotate as you pull them. That's what makes it hard to get it all back in time when you take it apart and put it back together, is to account for the rotate as they slide into one another. But also those gears are going to hit the drive gear for the oil pump drive, hence why I loosened everything. On top of it, there's really no good way to get this cover off. It's a large cover, it covers a lot of area. You can see that in typical fashion from the factory, they use a gasket and sealant, so you have to break all that sealant, you have to get this off. There's not a lot of good areas to pry on it because we don't have good access. It's kind of tucked back in there. And also we don't want to pry on the sealing surface anywhere where that gasket sits, because we don't want to mar it up and hamper or have any negative effect to the sealing surface. I can tell you that in the past, I've removed these with leaving the timing gears on, leaving these shafts in, and working the cover off, using like phenolic or nylon wedges in between there and driving it off, loosening the pump drive gear like I have here, and getting the entire assembly off with the gear on the crankshaft. It was a tremendous amount of work. It was frustrating. It was difficult. Going into this job, I was determined to find a better way. I got everything down to this point, and I was actually looking at this, kind of trying to decide what's going to be the better way to get this off. And ideally is what I'd like to do is I would like to get this cover off while retaining these gears and keeping them in the engine. So I need to find some way to get this bearing to press off the shaft of this gear and pull the cover off. So I was eyeballing this and I realized I have a boss right here for a bolt, which is for one of the plastic timing covers. And I have another one right over here, and they're almost in line with the shaft. It's like, that's good. Came to this side, I have the same thing all the way down, and this bolt hole right here for the cover plate is almost the same as well. So I ended up taking that stud out, and that gives me the access that I needed. And fortunately, since I'm at home and I have access to all my welders and bandsaws and tools, I just took some scrap angle iron and I did that so that way it's not going to deflect. I welded a nut on the back side. I mean, this is pretty down and dirty and crude. Drilled some holes, and I'm going to bolt these onto the timing cover. I'm going to drive these bolts in right here in the center. They're going to act right here on the shafts, and hopefully that's going to cause this drive shaft right here to stay in place. It'll pull the cover with these bearings off. These will stay in place. I'll keep my timing. I won't have to worry about the timing chain, and I won't have to worry about prying the cover off because it should pop off. So I'm going to get these installed, get you guys sit down, and we're going to see if my idea works like I hope. All right, so before we go to press this cover off and see if this tooling works, I'll show you how it's all set up. I have the center screws here, which it's hard to see, but there's actually a small recess in the center of the shaft, so these bolts actually go into that, so they're lined up correctly and it's not going to mushroom or damage anything. The nuts welded on the angle iron, so that way when I screw in this bolt, it's going to obviously get longer on the back side back here, which is going to move this angle iron out towards me. And since the angle iron's locked in place to the cover, it should pull the cover straight off towards me. I'll bounce back and forth in between these two, and hopefully I can bring it evenly out with not too much force. I plan on using a small 1/4-inch ratchet. Don't want to have to really reef on it too much, but I think it's going to work. It's time to sit you guys down and see if this idea does work. All right, so let's see how this works out. We'll just carefully give it a little bit of pressure. All right, so I can start to hear the sealant cracking, which is a good sign. Here it's starting to separate the sealant and the gasket, so it means this is working to some degree. There we go. I can just see the bearings sliding on our shaft over here. That cover just popped free. There we go. this bearing definitely tighter on this shaft, but it's coming off nicely. Yeah, this is working good. And it looks like my oil pump drive gear is staying in place, working just like I thought it was going to. Are we free? I think we're free. Oh, beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Okay, so cover's off, and that worked great. That was absolutely fantastic. Honestly, even counting the time it took me to make the tool, that was far quicker than the last time I've done this. Now we can see those gear and those teeth that I was talking about. So when you pull this out, it's going to want to rotate because those teeth are at that angle there. And also you can see where we're interfering with an oil pump drive right here at this chain, where we can't pull those forward because of this drive. So if we didn't press it off the way we did, and we were taking these entire shafts with gears with it, we'd have to slide this off the crankshaft as well. Obviously work it around all of our chain guides, and it's really cumbersome, especially with trying not to mar up the surface like I mentioned. That tool that I used, we didn't touch anything on that surface, and it pressed everything off, and I can leave all this in place, which was absolutely ideal. What I'm hoping for now, since I have these in and these are still splined where they need to be onto the crankshaft, kind of thinking out loud now, I still will have to pull this off in the oil pump drive because I need to get these gears off to get to the bearings behind them. But what I was really hoping for is, now that I have this way, I can make some more marks on these gears in the case or wherever I want to make them. So that way, when I take these gears off and slide them back into position, I can get them in the exact same spot, and I'll know that they're where they need to be. And I can even put the cover on and confirm, just hold it up there and confirm that these keyways are where they need to be in relation to the cover. I guess I just leave the cover bearings out. And a little bit of extra time being sure that I get these back in the correct position is really going to save me a lot on my camshaft timing. And you can see how small these teeth are and what they're splined. That's where it all goes awry when you have this and you're sliding this back together. You think you have it in the right position, and they just slide and kind of indexed. And when you're dealing with all that sealant that's on here, this drive gear, you take everything into account. You kind of have one shot at it, and if you don't get them indexed quite correctly, they're going to be off a tooth, which isn't a big deal, but it has a big effect all the way through all of your cam timing. So with the way that I got this done here, I can reassemble them back in, and basically I'll reverse my entire process once all the bearings are replaced. I can put these back in just like so, line everything up before I put the cover on, before I have any sealant to worry about, and I already will know that everything's back where it needs to be. Things are looking good. I really like what we got going on here. So our special tooling was 100% worth the time invested to get that made and built. Yep, it kind of took me off of the car for a little bit while I was building the tooling, but I can tell you what, it made that so much easier. And I'm really glad it worked out quite nicely, and I'm pretty excited for reassembly. I think I got ourselves set up in a really good position. However, I don't have my new parts yet, so they're due in I think 2 days, all my bearings, my gaskets and everything, so there's really not a lot that I can do right now. Sure, I got all the cleanup I need to take care of, scrape the gaskets off, drive the old bearings. We still have the disassembly here to get to those bearings, but honestly, it is the end of my day. It's the end of my work week. I think I'm just going to pause right here and call it a day. I'm going to leave that so it can let the oil drip out over the weekend. And once we have the parts, we'll be back in the shop, trucking along, continuing on, getting this front cover resealed and all the bearings rebuilt. All right, so I made it through my work weekend. That means we are back out in the shop and continuing on our 456 front cover reseal. Now, as for the car, everything is exactly how I left it off at the end of last week. Once I got the front cover off, I left it exactly like this, hoping that what little oil is left on it is going to continue to leak out over the weekend and make my cleanup be a lot easier. Same thing up here for the front cover and our smaller cover. Just left them in the drain pan so that way any oil that's on the inside of them is just going to leak out. And it's going to make it a lot easier for me to work on them and handle them and minimize my cleanup. And fortunately, all of the parts that we need for this reseal slash, it's actually, I would say, a rebuild, finally came in. So I have all of my gaskets that I need, my new crank seal. More importantly, I have the rear bearings, the front bearings, the sealing O-rings, and new ring nuts. With all of these components, I have everything that I need on hand to get this resealed, but also rebuilt with all the bearings. Since we're there, we're going to put the new bearings in. I'll talk about that in a little bit when we're going to work to get the bearings in the cover. But I have everything I need. So my plan of attack, first thing today is I need to spend a little bit of time, and I have a lot of gaskets to clean off. So I need to get these gaskets off, all the gasket material off here. You can see that I have this other gasket on the back side. Same thing, get that all cleaned up. And the few traces of gasket that are stuck here on the front of the engine. And I also probably will come in and take these two Allens out for this guide here for the chain. I'll slide this off. We already have this loose on the oil pump, and the chain here, or the gear on the crank snout, it just slides forward. So I'm going to take that entire drive and chain off, set it aside, and then I'll continue to clean all the gaskets off the front of the engine and get all the oil and everything cleaned up out of here, just so that way we don't have to work in all of the oil. So I'm going to set you guys down because that stuff's pretty boring and tedious. I'm going to focus on getting all that taken care of, and then once I'm at the point where we're ready to press out these old bearings and replace all the bearings for this front drive, I'll bring you guys back and we'll walk you guys through that process. Okay, so we got our covers all cleaned up, and it went pretty much as expected. Really the only thing to note or talk about is from the factory, this car had a black, kind of like a rubbery undercoating that was sprayed on the bottom side, and it had overspray that was on the front cover and on this smaller cover here. As soon as I sprayed this down with my brake clean, that undercoating started to flake, and like it started to shrivel and peel right off of this cover. Not all of it, but a lot of it did. I just decided at that point to get it all removed from this cover the best I could, so that way it looked clean and uniform. I'm not going to do that to the rest of the car on the engine, because I think I'll just open up a can of worms chasing all that undercoating. Rather than have where you could see it was sprayed on here and then half of it was flaking off, I figured it was best just to remove what was on here so this looks one clean sanitary piece. So you can see we got all of the old gaskets off, all the silicone off. We Scotch-Brited our surface. Same thing on the back side, got all the oil off of it, everything's cleaned. And the same thing with this little cover here, got everything cleaned up on it. You can kind of see where the oil sits on this cover, the pool of oil there. It is all pretty much cleaned and prepped and ready to go back onto the car. But before this goes back on the car, we need to deal with our bearings. We're going to be replacing the front bearings, and there's also a set of rear bearings that are holding the shafts on the block right now. We're going to address those also. And we have our new parts up here. These are my rear bearings back here. You can see that it is an open ball bearing, and that is because this bearing is lubricated by all of the engine oil. So this is more of a precautionary measure since we're here doing this to replace these bearings. These are not the main concern of this. It's our front bearings here that are the main concern. You can see I still have the OEM bearings in right here, and if you notice, they have a rubber lip seal on them on the back side. and also on the front. So these bearings are not lubricated by the engine oil. They're internally greased from the factory. They're sealed off, and they're really not serviceable. Really nothing we could do on that grease. If we have a bearing that's wearing or that seizes up here, which can happen, obviously we're going to have a big problem because that's going to lock up that bearing, which causes a catastrophic failure of our gears, our timing belts, our valves, valve train, whole engine. So these bearings being non-serviceable and non-lubricated by the engine, basically anytime I have a cover off, we put new ones in. Now the bearings that are going back in are Hill Engineering bearings because, again, like most things that Hill makes, they are a step above the factory bearings, so they have better seals in them. Hill has these specifically made for these applications, and they are, like most Hill products, priced better than the factory bearings. So that's what we're going to be using going back together. These rear bearings, they're factory bearings. The rest of the parts are all factory. Only change is those Hill bearings. Not much to talk about here. We're using factory gaskets, so you can see there's really nothing too special on those. As for these bearings, they're press fit in. You can see that there's a snap ring here on the front side of this cover, and you'll also notice that there's a snap ring on the back side of this cover. This bearing, I've already went and removed the rear snap ring and the front snap ring. You could try to remove, say, just one snap ring and press the bearing out. I'm going to press them out from the back side out through the front. But I removed the rear snap ring because A, it has a spacer shim behind it, so I was able to remove that. But it's going to just give me more surface area, so when I'm pressing this bearing out from the back side, that the tooling that I'm using to rest on the bearing, I can be sure that I'm not going to accidentally catch part of that snap ring and potentially cause more damage. So it's really just a matter of precaution. These are so quick and easy to remove. I'm just going to remove them, get them out of my way so I don't have to worry about it, so that way I can press these out trouble-free. So I'm going to take everything over to the press, get it set up, get these bearings pressed out, and then we'll get our O-rings replaced. Then we'll work to get the new bearings pressed in. So I'm going to be using this round sleeve, which sits nicely right on our flange on the front side to support everything as I press the bearings out on the back side. And then I just have a small puck that fits nicely on the bearing, and that's going to make it easy for me to get everything set up here in my press and pop these guys out real quick. Okay, so we got both of the old bearings pressed out, and we're ready to press in our new bearings. However, there is one small caveat, and if you look on the inside there, the bearings, the outside diameter of the bearings, are sealed with 2 rubber O-rings. So I've already replaced those. These are the old O-rings right here. But that means that we need to be very mindful when we press these bearings in, that we don't catch those O-rings and snag it and tear it, because then we're going to have an oil leak out of the front of this cover. These bearings, you can see that they have a very generous rolled edge on the outside diameter on either side. So that's going to help get this bearing past those O-rings. I've also gone and lubricated the outside of this bearing with some light silicone grease. And I've done the inside of this bore as well, and that rubber O-ring. Now, one thing to note on these O-rings is they're a bit undersized where they fit into this groove in the front cover, meaning they are almost too small for the hole. You can kind of see how that one's kind of starting to protrude in. Same thing right there. So that's kind of common on a lot of Ferrari O-rings. What I do to overcome that, or to help with the install, is I actually take those 2 O-rings and I'll put it on each of my index fingers on my hand, and I'll just kind of roll the O-ring with my 2 fingers in it, stretching it out. Kind of like I did on the spark plug seal O-rings on the 355 we serviced a while back. And that helps stretch them out just enough so that way they sit in this nicely, and they sit, in a larger circumference, so that way they don't have the tendency to snag these bearings. So we have our new O-rings in, everything's lubed, these bearings are ready to go in. It's pretty important that you get them in. They're directional, so you can see that this is the front side of the bearing, and you can see there, since we can see the back side of the seal, that's the back side. So both seals are installed facing outward. So this bearing needs to go in like so. If we were to do this, we're asking for oil leaks, we're going to have problems. Now, dimensionally, this bearing bore in the front cover is the same diameter all the way through. So that means we have the ability to press this bearing in from the front side or the back side. It doesn't really make a difference with the front cover how we press the bearing in. What we need to keep in mind is that we don't snag or damage our O-ring that's in there. But there is one thing to keep in mind on what the bearing's seated on. That's because we have this beveled crush washer that sits on the back side of the rear snap ring, and that will have some crush and bend. So if we press the bearing in essentially from the front side back to this beveled washer, there's not a definite hard stop of where we're going to set this bearing at, because if I were to put this in the press and press this right now, I'm going to be able to compress that spring, meaning our depth of the bearing's not set and dedicated. It's not like we have a flanged or machined lip like you usually do that stops the bearing once you press it in. On the front side, we have just the snap ring, meaning that is going to be the locating factor for this bearing, where that snap ring sits in the groove in the housing and it sits firmly up against the outer race of the bearing. Then on the back side, this crush washer or beveled shim is kind of just going to float in there and take up the space between the race and the snap ring. So say we'd press the bearing in from the back side, so we'll flip this over. Say we'd have our outer snap ring in, and then we press the bearing all the way in, and then we'd have to try to get the snap ring in while we're fighting the tension of this beveled washer, and that could actually give us a lot of grief and make it much more difficult than it needs to be to install everything. So I'm actually going to leave all the snap rings out. I'm going to press the bearings in from the front side, pushing in, and I'm going to leave the snap rings out because that will give me access from the other side to really get a good eye on my O-ring. So we're going to be taking this cover out through the press process and just checking that O-ring that we haven't damaged it. Once I get that bearing outer race clear of that O-ring and we know we have no damage, so the bearing's going to be halfway pressed into there, I'm going to come back, I'm going to install our washer, and I'm going to install our snap ring before the bearing comes back and rests on them. That means I'm not going to be fighting the spring tension of this bevel washer. It's going to allow me to put that snap ring in easily. And then I'm going to continue coming up on this side, pressing the bearing down so it seats. I'm going to compress everything just a little bit to compress this washer to make it easier to get the outer snap ring in. And then I'm going to come back, flip it back over, and give it a real light, gentle press to be sure I have the outer race pressed up on the front snap ring, because this front snap ring that sits on the front side of the cover is the one part that locates the bearing in the cover. So let's take everything over to the press and get them installed. Take another peek. And there we are. So we can see that we're pretty much right on that O-ring, so I just want to be real careful as I press it and keep checking it, because it's really going to be a lot of work to come back and fix that if we damage it. So we're just going to take our time and go by hand, as little pressure as we can, and work that bearing past that O-ring so it moved just a little bit. So this is tedious, but it's definitely worth it. Again, so you can see now it's starting to sit in that bevel, and we're getting clear of that O-ring all the way around. Almost there. And one thing that's important to note when you're pressing a bearing is think about what you're pressing. So right now all of our force is going on the outer race, so I want to be sure that all my tooling is pushing on the outer race. I don't want to be pushing on the inner race of the bearing, because then I'm transferring all my load through the balls of the bearing to the outer race, and that's how you damage them. Depending if we're pushing a bearing on by the inner race or outer race, depends on where we put our tooling to actually press the bearing. And it looks like we've made it, for the most part, past our O-ring. I'm probably going to go just a little bit further before I put my snap rings in. There we go. So we can see that we've driven it past it. I can see that there's no torn green section in there. The O-ring's all in place. We didn't snag it. And it's looking really good. So now we could put our washer in, and the point that's pointed up, this side right here, this side right here faces the bearing. So we're going to slide that in the bore, and we'll get our crush ring on, or get our snap ring installed. Continue to drive the bearing in. Doesn't take a whole lot to push these bearings in. Everything's wanting to stop, so we'll take it out and see if we can't get our front snap ring in now. And now that we have it seated, I'm going to just give it a little bit of pressure here to be sure that the bearing's sitting up tight on the front snap ring and that we don't have any tension on that washer, as little as possible. Yeah, it moved just a little bit, but now we're seated up on the front snap ring. There we go. I like it. Bearing installed. And of course, have to have all the snap rings face upwards. So, I'll work to get the other bearing in, and then we'll continue on with this project. Alright, so our bearings are pressed in the front cover, all the snap rings are in, and they're seated on the outer snap rings here. Now anytime you're pressing a bearing on and you're done pressing it, you want to run the bearing and make sure that it's just as free and smooth as it was before you did it. Like I was mentioning when I was pressing these bearings in, you want to be sure that you're not putting the load through this inner race right here, because it's going to transfer that load through the ball bearings inside. So this, since we can see them, you're going to be pushing on this race and then pushing on those balls and then pushing on the outer race. That would be causing a lot of damage potentially to the balls, and that's how you either damage those balls by putting a flat spot in them or cracking them, and then that's how these bearings go bad. So since we're pressing on the outer race to the cover, we want to be sure that all of our tooling sits on the outer race of these bearings. Now if we are pressing this bearing onto a shaft on the inside, we would want to flip it and be sure that we're pressing on this inner race, not the outer race. So just know what you're pressing it onto, think about it a little bit, and be sure you set your tooling up accordingly. Everything's pretty much taken care of on this front cover with the exception to our crankshaft seal here. I'm going to leave that off because that's one less thing to worry about when I'm reinstalling this front cover, and we will install this into the front cover once it's on the engine. It just makes the installation a little bit easier because I don't have to worry about damaging the seal or catching an edge. With that, I think we should talk about getting these bearings installed in the car. And now, since I've gone through, I pulled off the chain for the oil pump drive and the gear, cleaned all the oil off, and you can see that I put corresponding paint marks here on these gears. So you can see that these gears have a very fine teeth, and the gears are helical, they're at an angle, they're not straight. So when I slide this gear out, it's actually going to rotate. And that's really the problem with doing this repair if you leave these gears on the front cover. Because when you pull these off, they're going to rotate. You're not going to be able to track where they were at because you just have a lot going on, and it's nearly impossible to get them reinstalled and account for the rotation to get them back in, and that's how you lose your camshaft timing. So since we made that tooling and we were able to leave these in place, I just put some pretty ugly paint marks here. I just did 2 different colors so I know which gear goes to which side, and really my intention with those marks is just to see what teeth spline in with one another, and that's going to allow me to get these out so we can replace those rear bearings. And the whole goal and point of these paint marks is so I can reinstall these in the exact same position. These gears, the back side, it's a pretty tight fit. They're pretty much pressed into that bearing, so we're going to need some tooling to get these driven out so we can get to the rear bearings. So they get the timing shafts pulled out of the bearings in the block. I just use this small little 2-pound slide hammer puller. So I'm going to get this set up, show you how I configure it onto those shafts so we can get them driven out of the block. Alright, so we have just enough space to get this puller set up in here, and I actually thread this center shaft of the puller in as deep as I can into the shaft in the center hole here. That helps shorten up the entire assembly, also just helps stabilize everything. I put one of the old nuts on here, and I just have each teeth on, grabbing onto it, and I have enough space back here, so we would have to pull the radiator fans if that was still in the car to get this out, or we would just modify the tool to shorten it up so that way it's not hitting everything. But since that's not here, I don't have to worry about it. But we'll see if I can just gently give this some taps with my left hand. And you can see that the gear's slowly working out. A little awkward here with my left hand. I want to be sure I don't hit my condenser. There we go. It's out. There's our gear. So really not too bad. We do need that puller, but now we need the work to get that bearing out. But first, I'll take this other shaft out. Alright, so we got both of the bearings out of the block, and now that I've cleaned everything up, you guys have really good access. You can see right there, there's holes that feed pressurized oil to these bearings. So that's one of the main reasons why these inner bearings aren't as much as a concern as the outer bearings, and that's because they have such an excellent lubrication source. But since we're here, we're going to replace them anyways. You'll see here on the bearing, you can take a good peek at it. Nothing too fancy. One thing I will note that the other bearings that we will be putting in, they only have this cage holding the balls in on one side. The other side is exposed and the balls are open. So I'm going to install those new bearings with that cage facing outward, so that way that pressurized oiling has a better chance of getting directly in on the balls of the bearing. And to get these out, I used a pilot bearing puller, and you can see it just goes on the inside, grabs the inside race of the bearing. I was able to set it here on the block and pull it out. Now I will say that sometimes these bearings do not want to come out of the block. It's an incredibly tight fit, which was the case that I had here. The first couple of attempts that I had to pull it out with this tool, it actually would pop my teeth here off the inside race and slide out and would not budge the bearing. So I ended up taking my MAP gas torch right here and just heating up around the block, around the perimeter, just trying to get that metal to expand some. And then I came back with my puller and I was able to pull them out. So everything's cleaned up and we're actually ready to get the new bearings in. And because on this particular engine, on how much force it took to pull them out and how much heat I had to apply to them, I actually have my new bearings in the house in the freezer, so that way they will shrink down and hopefully reduce the size just a little bit. And then I'm going to come back and heat this up as well to try to get the block to expand, and I'm trying to just basically use the best methods that I have here available to get a, minimize the thermal fit, so to speak. If I can expand this a little bit and if I can shrink the bearings a little bit, they're going to slide in a lot easier and I can be sure that they're bottom and seated. To drive them in, I'm just going to use this socket. This happens to be what? A 29mm snap-on socket. You can see it's been used quite a bit for installing bearings and other purposes, but this fits nicely on the outside race of the bearing. And it slides all the way in my hole, so I know I'm not going to get stuck on the hole, and the inside diameter is just fine. So that's going to be my plan of attack. Heat up the block. We've got the bearings in there shrinking down, and just gently tap them in with our socket and a hammer, and we should be ready to go. So let's get them installed. And you're going to hear the sound change when I'm hitting that in, and that's where the bearing's bottoming out in the block. Make sure it's all the way seated. There we go. Spins freely. All right. We'll do the other side. There we go. Both bearings are installed. They spin nice and free. All right, we have the rear bearings installed, so now it's time to install the timing shafts and gears. And this is where we're going to rely on our paint marks that we made here on the crankshaft and on the gear, so that way we can get the same teeth engaged on the two. But the trouble with it is it's going to want to rotate in, so we don't have great visibility. See, like right here, it's really hard to see how they line up. But if I take the gear and put it at an angle, I can see right here that my teeth are off. Right here, they line up nicely. That looks about right. We'll go one more tooth over, and that looks incorrect. So we go right here, and we know that is where the teeth were lined up. So now I'm leaving these teeth spline together, and I'm just kind of rotating this gear out until the pilot on the back side slides into our bearing. And if you look at it from the front side now, because of the helical cut of the gears, the teeth are misaligned. But when I drive this gear and shaft back into the bearing, they're going to line up right where we want them. So I just have my old nuts on the front of the shaft, a socket to fit over the face of the nut, and you can see the gear rotate as it goes back. Right there. And we have everything aligned just like we want it. Again, we're 90 degrees here on the side, where our keyway is for our Woodruff key for our outer gear that goes on. Looks pretty good. Let's get bank 2 done. So that looks like it right there. That's wrong. That's good. All right, we'll rotate our gear. Get our pilot started in the bearing. There we go. And drive this one back in. Just like so. Alright, so we got our gears in. I took a second and went back and looked at some photos I had from disassembly just to be sure that my paint marks all line up and I have these two gears meshed in correctly where I want them on the crankshaft gear. Everything looks good, so I'm going to work to clean off all my paint marks. Again, I don't like leaving any evidence that I was here. Get that cleaned up. I'm also going to take a second to reinstall our chain for our oil pump drive and our upper guide. Get everything reinstalled in preparation for getting this front cover reinstalled back on the engine. Alright, so we got the oil pump drivetrain reinstalled. Really nothing too special there. Just slid everything on, put our lower bolt in, cleaned all the oil out, gave it a little Loctite, torqued at the spec, got our upper guide on. And then I have come back through one last time and cleaned all of my sealing surface with brake clean to be sure there's no oil on it. And essentially everything over here on the engine is ready to go and ready for the reinstallation of the front cover. Now, over here on the bench, we have our front cover, and same thing. Everything's been cleaned, wiped it down one more time to make sure we have a good sealing surface. We have our bearings in. We can double check that they're installed the correct direction where we see the back sides of our oil seals here. All of our snap rings are in and seated. Everything's looking really good. Now we do have studs here where we can basically, if we slide this front cover on, we could use the hardware on these studs and some longer bolts possibly and press the front cover on and into place. However, if you remember on disassembly, the whole issue was the fit of the inside race of these bearings on our timing shafts. So we have an old bearing here, and I'll show you by sliding this on the shaft. You can see it comes up and stops, but it actually needs to sit all the way back there. So to get this front cover installed and not cause any damage to these bearings and ensure that they're seated all the way in, I use some 3/4 inch by 1 inch spacers. I sit them right here on the bearings at the front cover. And I have this longer spacer that I can set here to help drive these back just a little bit until I have enough thread showing where I'll use my old nuts right here, and then I'll basically use the existing shaft as a press to press the cover back and get it seated on the block. And then we'll do all of our perimeter hardware, make sure everything's seated, and then we'll take our nuts and sleeves off. Also, I will install the gasket on the engine, not the front cover, so that way it's just one less thing for me to worry about while I'm installing this cover. Now coming over, we have our gasket here. Just the typical Ferrari paper gasket with the impregnated silicone around the outside. And as we saw when we took the cover off from the factory, it's sealed with 3-bond 1211. Now this is one of those few areas where I deviate from what the factory did, and I will be sealing this with 3-bond 1217H. This is a much more robust sealant. This stuff is a lot stronger, it seals a lot better, it's not as affected by brake clean. And I do this on this particular application because this is not a high service item. So I've talked about this in the past videos, specifically when we're talking about valve covers. And when I reseal the valve covers, I use this in the key areas in the corners, but the majority of the valve cover, I still use this 1211. Although it's not as great of a sealant as this, it's a lot more serviceable. So on items where we have the valve covers on and off during each belt service, using the 1211 makes it a lot easier on the next guy to get everything cleaned up, prepped, and reinstalled, and this works just fine and adequate for the car in between belt services. However, I don't use this 1217 here because it is a lot more work to get cleaned off, and if I use that on the valve covers, it just takes the next guy a lot longer to get everything cleaned and prepped, and it's a little bit overkill, it's tedious, and again, because we're removing them and reinstalling them, it's just making future timing belt services and repairs much harder than they need to be. Now over here with our front timing cover, this is not a regularly serviced item, and hopefully this does not leak again. And I actually want to use the stronger sealant to be sure that it doesn't end up leaking, so that way it doesn't have to come off. And really, considering the amount of work it takes to get here, it's not that big of a deal using the more aggressive sealant to be sure that it's sealed all the way up. Now I didn't really mention it, but when I pulled this apart, my existing gasket was in one piece. Meaning it's not so much the gaskets that fail, it's the sealant that's in there that's failing and causing these to leak. So we're going to use the better sealant, make sure this is sealed up nice and tight and doesn't have any leaks or drips for the client down the road. So with this sealant, I do apply it on both sides of the gasket, and I only put enough on essentially just to barely coat the surface. So I'll use this applicator, I'll squeeze it out onto the gasket, and then I run my finger across it just to basically get it as thin as possible so there's not a ton of squeeze out once we reinstall everything. So I'll get this sealant probably installed here on the back side of this gasket, and I'll get this gasket slid into place here on the front of the engine, and then I'll probably just come through because it's a lot easier and apply the second coat of sealant on the back side of this cover, and then that's going to let us get this in place and installed. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and get my sealant applied to the gasket and the front cover, and we'll work to get it reinstalled in the front of the engine. Alright, before I spread the sealant out with my finger, I just wanted to show you what it looks like and how much I'm installing on the back side of the gasket. Now, one of the advantages of spreading it out with my finger, it just helps me distribute it evenly and make sure there's no dried bits or clumps in it, and it gets rid of any of the excess or any areas where I don't have enough. So I'll get this spread out and I'll show you the after. Alright, and our sealant's on the back side of the front cover. So we'll line it up on our studs, get our shafts and our bearings. And now we're starting to get the resistance of the bearings, and you can see that our spacers, there's just not enough there to get our nuts started. So that's where we'll take the longer spacer here and get this cover worked back some. All right, so I'm seated as far as I can go with our bearings and shafts. Now it's time to work on the perimeter hardware. All right, so let's get you guys caught up with where we're at. So we got the front cover installed mainly by driving the bearings over the shafts with those spacers and the old nuts, not the new nuts. And once I had those bottomed out, I went through and installed all the hardware around the perimeter and torqued at the spec. I will thank Ferrari for choosing to use 13mm nuts here, 10mm nuts here. We have some 5mm Allens on the bottom and even some 6mm. So they were kind enough to give me 4 different fastener types to get this front cover installed. Kind of comical, but it's just how it is. So we got that fully on, installed and torqued. And then I came back and removed my spacers, put the Woodruff keys in both of the shafts, slid on our belt drive gears here on the bottom. And then I actually used the old nuts, not the new ones, ran these back on and tightened them all the way down. Now I did so because the torque spec's relatively light on these nuts, especially in the new ones. And the nuts are like a castellated nut or like a self-locking type nut. So you have the friction of the nut that you're installing as well. And I wanted to be sure that I had the shafts and the bearings and these gears all seated. So I used the old nuts and just tightened everything down, and I could actually feel once the nuts kind of bottomed out on the gears, I could feel everything moving in the position until I ran out of movement on the nuts itself. Once I had that done, I took the old nuts off. I put a little bit of blue Loctite on the shafts, installed our new nuts, torqued them to 118 Newton meters, and then you can see I have the anti-tamper marking on them. So those are on, installed, and torqued the spec, and we are good to go. And if you guys notice, we hit our objective. We're lined up, so we got this gear back on our indexing spline that we did, and over here on bank 1 as well. So we are set on there. So now that I know that I got these back where I want them, I'm going to come back and clean that paint off. And in order to do so, again, just a little pocket screwdriver, and you can see the paint pretty much just chips off, comes straight off, leaves no evidence there. Come back with a little rag and brake clean. I can wipe all that off. You'll never see that it was there. So I'll get the rest of these marks off and these bottom ones. Again, I don't like leaving any trace that I was here. I did come through after the sealant set up and I cleaned off any of the excess that squeezed out. I got that taken care of. And down here at the bottom, the crank seal is installed. Now I said that I do that after the fact, and that's because If I were to leave this crank seal on, I would be worried about pressing this cover on and getting these bearings through the shafts appropriately. And I'd also have to be paying attention to make sure that the inside diameter of the seal is not getting stuck on the crankshaft and torn, as well as all my studs and gasket on the outside. That's a lot to watch for and do. By leaving this front crank seal out, I don't have to worry about it, and I can just focus on my bearings and my gasket once everything's installed. I install this separately, and actually you can set this in place. Again, I use my pocket screwdriver, and I can actually work the crankshaft seal over that lip right there. You can see where it's raised. I can actually work the edge of that seal up over that, and then I can drive it in place in the housing, and that way I can ensure I don't do any damage to the seal and everything's exactly where it needs to be, how it needs to be. I also got our new oil filters on. Of course, we date them, and our front cover on, sealed up, and again, all the sealant cleaned off, all the bolts torqued. So we're pretty much set up here on the front. We achieved our objective of getting these back in the position we wanted to. Now we need to focus on getting the power steering and reinstalled in all our bracketry. I will say that I have gone through, cleaned all this stuff separately so I can get this all put on pretty quickly. I did take the opportunity to press in our new bearings on our idler gears and got everything cleaned up. So I'm just gonna set you guys down and work to get all this stuff reinstalled back into the car. Alright, we have our power steering brackets back on, our pump is installed, everything's tightened down. We have our idlers back on with our fresh bearings. Both of those are good to go. And obviously we have our front cover back on with new bearings, gaskets, and seals. essentially we have everything up here right back to where we started. All right, so overall that process isn't too bad, although it is tedious and we do need some special tooling in order to pull it off. Now I can tell you that throughout the years of my career that I have resealed and rebuilt many front timing covers on these cars. However, all the times that I've done this repair before today, I've always left my timing shafts and timing belt gears on the front cover and removed it as an entire assembly. And I can tell you that doing it that way is the long and hard way. Very frustrating. The way we went about this repair today with making the tooling so that way we could press the gears out of the front cover and press the front cover off of the engine, not only did it make it tremendously easier to get the front cover separated from the engine, but the biggest benefit in my opinion is we were able to maintain our timing or orientation of our gears into the crankshaft and our lower timing belt drive gears. I mentioned it earlier, when I did my pre-service checks on this car, I checked the camshaft timing. All 4 camshafts were within or plus or minus 1 degree of factory specs. So I wanted to make sure that I could do everything in my power to get this reassembled and back in that orientation, because once I go and have the belts back on, I'm working through the camshaft timing. The closer I am to specs, a lot easier it's going to be for me to get this dialed in exactly where I want it. In the end, slowing down, being methodical, and being sure I keep everything in the right location while I reseal that front cover is going to save me time when I get to the camshaft timing. So I'm going to continue making forward progress on my belt service in this 456. The next steps for me are to get my timing belts reinstalled, getting them tensioned, and then I'm going to go through and degree in the camshafts. So if you guys want to see that process, be sure to jump in the playlist and check out the other videos I have on this 456. As always, guys, I greatly appreciate your support. Be sure to like, share, subscribe. Give me your comments below. Let me know what you thought of the video. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.